Hey, everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Nonprofit Show. We're really excited to welcome back Kirsten Wantland from Bloomerang, our friends over there. But Kirsten, you're in a really interesting part of the nonprofit sector because you deal with the issue of volunteerism and management and all those. I'm really excited to have this conversation because we teed this up saying it's beyond the sign up sheet. How do we build this long lasting impact and relationship? And so this is going to be a lot of fun. Welcome back, my friend.
Thanks for having me. Always great to kind of come on and rep Bloomerang here and kind of spread some knowledge that can hopefully have an impact.
Yeah, well, I know it will because this is such a hot topic. The whole issue of volunteers, and we call them the lifeblood of our nonprofit sector. And we're going to get into it. And, the lifeblood of our endeavor here on the Nonprofit Show are undoubtedly our presenting sponsors, and they include Bloomerang, American Nonprofit Academy, Staffing Boutique, JMT Consulting, Interim Executives Academy, Your Part-Time Controller, and Fundraisers Friday. I'm Julia C. Patrick, CEO of the American Nonprofit Academy. But more importantly, Kirsten Wantland, yay. Okay, tell me what your work is, because it's very interesting. You're one of these magical people at Bloomerang. First of all, I want to know what your professional designations are.
Yeah, awesome.
Question number one. And then if you'll share with us what it is that you do.
Yeah, sweet. So my designations after my name here, the CNC is I'm a certified nonprofit consultant, and the CDE means I'm a certified development executive. So in my outside of Bloomerang world, I do have fundraising credentials and a master's in nonprofit management and leadership. And ultimately that gives me a really great perspective to say, how do we see the effect of things beyond what we're just dealing with now? So it's given me a lot of really great perspective that I bring into my job at Bloomerang. And then as the customer best practices and enablement manager, this is a new role that I've just stepped into. And this will be one that can align the experience for organizations that utilize Bloomerang to say, what is best practice for this particular workflow, so that way organizations that are using the software have a lot of guidance and to say, this is the impact that's going to give you the best results. So my work with Bloomerang in the last couple of years has been primarily with clients on kind of giving them a roadmap of how to utilize their software to make their workflows more efficient. And then the other half of my work has been like fundraising strategy support. So I've been working with organizations for years where we say, let's make this strategic change. How do we measure the impact on what that does to your retention, to your average lifetime value, to even the loyalty? So in a nutshell, that was a pretty big nutshell, but
no, it's great.
Cool.
Okay, so I'm like blown away. It's like I almost want to cry right now because I'm thinking, I certainly have decades on you. And I think about the trajectory of my life, my community, the sector of the nonprofit world. Holy crap, if I had had the opportunity in higher ed to pursue some of this education, how different my community would look today, how different my engagement would be in the city that I love, in the state that I love. I mean, we never had these opportunities to really explore in an intellectual manner what all this meant. Instead, we just used our empathy, our passion, our sense of value, right? Which is great, but it only takes you so far. You have to be educated and strategic. So
Well, and
I love this.
I'll tell you something funny about that too. So I was a presenter this year at GiveCon, and our closing keynote, Simon Scriver, I'm gonna tag him on this LinkedIn post later, but he had made a funny joke in the closing keynote that said, who in this room like intended to be in fundraising, right? And I raised my hand because I'm like, it's me. I did my master's. I had this vision of being in the sector. And I was the only person in a room of about 350 people that raised their hand. And he's like, none of us intended to be here except that one weirdo in the back, right? That one weirdo is me, right? So I think having that guidance, I'm very blessed and kind of privileged to be able to say, I knew I wanted to work in that sector. I knew I wanted to be in here in some manner. And then having the opportunity to kind of explore that interest, it's invaluable at this stage of my career. So I appreciate it.
Well, you know what? It's invaluable to our entire sector. This is the thing. This is what I just love. I mean, first of all, for the next, short span of time, 30 minutes, everything that you say is going to have a hell of a lot more credibility with me because you're an educated woman, right?
Great.
And I think a lot of times what happens is we get this passion and we get this energy towards something within our sector, and it doesn't really function properly because it's not always strategic, right?
Mhm.
It's just passionate, and passion burns out. I mean, the flame
It does.
burns out.
Yeah.
So this is so interesting. Well, good for you. Oh my God. I'm like, you just made my week. I'm so excited.
Great. Awesome.
Okay, well, let's get back now that we've had this like sisterly rah-rah moment and reconstituting the essence of educating our sector in the nonprofit management. You've talked to us about volunteerism, but one of your points that you want to make here with us today is that we need to be cultivating volunteers with clarity. What does that mean to you?
Oh, well, this can mean a lot of different things. So firstly, like before you even start thinking about talking to volunteers, right? We should have a really clear expectation of what that volunteer role will be. What will the commitment be? Is there a minimum that they have to do? Do they have to have certain credentials, right? So part of this sets expectations up for the volunteer to show up to your property or in whatever way that they're being involved and saying, I know exactly what my expectations are for success. And then for your organization, that will also set appropriate expectations of how much you're going to rely on that role and how critical it is for your organization to fill it. So in certain organizations, I've done a lot of different volunteer coordination roles where sometimes the volunteers are doing office work where there's stuff in envelopes, right? They're getting out that appeal that you have a short time frame to turn around. So we do have to rely on that volunteer showing up that day. And other times we have lower, what I would say lower bandwidth commitments that are like, I'm showing up to help with an event tonight. So the clarity on that and saying, this is what I'm going to do. And even as that affects abilities and skill sets, having that appropriate expectation. And that's just really saying, Kirst, this is what you're going to do for me today. You're going to check those security bags. You're going to make sure our audience is safe, right? You're going to be standing for about 2 hours, but then you can enjoy the show. So that sets a really clear expectation of what their commitment is, what their duties may look like. So clarity in that manner, just setting the stage will really give them the proper expectation and ultimately a good experience. Because if they show up and they're like, oh, I was expecting to do this, I didn't really know what I was going to be doing while I was there. We don't want that to have a negative impact on that volunteer's experience.
So let me drill down a little bit because I'm curious, is this something I'm thinking job description oriented?
Yep.
Is this something that's like printed in a policy and they have to sign off? Or is this just like verbally, during an orientation? Yeah. How do we navigate this actual process?
Yeah, so I think it can be one and all of those things at once. It kind of depends on the complexity of your volunteer opportunity. But firstly, like as you're communicating to your community, whether that be via email or you're posting on, some volunteer websites to a call for volunteers, right? That can be the job description or the position description for the commitment there. Almost all of these kind of posts and things, they'll have a waiver that your organization, your volunteers will sign and all that stuff. But it ultimately just makes sure that you're communicating what the impact is. And they're saying by showing up for it, by signing up for it, they're saying, yes, I can do these things. I'm excited to do these things. Okay. So that can mean it in that manner. And then for longer term commitments, definitely I would recommend doing some sort of orientation program. Even as I did special events, I used to coordinate fine arts programs and we would have ushers. So we would have a little usher meeting like an hour before the performance. And we're going to say, hey, Julia, we're going to have you on this door. All you have to do is tear the ticket stub and I'll come dismiss you. Let me know if you have any problems, right? So it just gives them some clear guidance to say, what do I do when something happens that I wasn't expecting? Or what do I do the entire time, right? It just gives them some clarity so they don't go in with unanswered questions.
I love it. I think it's really an interesting way to have to start off this conversation. So you're talking about kind of navigating, and if you will, an orientation, level setting expectations, expressing what the process is, welcoming, connecting to your mission, all of these things. So then let's move a little bit forward and talk about how we retain these people and how
Mm,
we recognize them and honor that they're giving time, resources, and if ultimately treasure.
yeah.
How do we get these people to commit to us?
Yeah, like, and that's the first set of the stage, right? So let's say we're talking about retaining those volunteers. We've already got them once. And
Yeah.
I'm gonna talk more from like a special events related lens right now.
Mhm.
But that could be as simple as those volunteers having name tags and saying, instead of just saying, "Hey, are you doing good?" Like you're saying, "Hey, Julia, do you need anything?" Right?
Yes.
Giving them that recognition via
Yeah.
name, it helps them feel visible, it helps them feel
Mhm.
important. And ultimately, like, thinking of this as a fundraiser, it's the same kind of experience you want to cultivate with donors, right? We want them to feel important and connected and critical to the mission. And ultimately, if we can say, "Julia, thank you so much for checking bags today. We could not have done it without
Mhm.
you. Enjoy the show." That helps them kind of have that warm and
Right.
fuzzy feeling, so to
Yeah.
say, I feel committed to the organization because I know that I had an impact. I know Julia appreciated me today. So
Mhm.
ultimately, making sure that they feel recognized at the event during their volunteer opportunity is really important. And then later, as we kind of move away from the event. So oftentimes, as volunteer coordinators, as fundraisers, we are kind of in a state of like, my hair feels like it's on fire all the time, right? We're always kind of working towards the next event or the next
Yeah.
appeal or the
Yeah.
next donor meeting. But ultimately, like building a volunteer program where we're going to have folks come back each time or each weekend or each month, whatever that looks like, right? What is your follow-up plan for those volunteers? Before that event, weeks before the event, I want you to think about what that follow-up plan is. Even
Mhm.
if that's, I'm just going to call them and I'm going to leave Kirst a voicemail that says, "Hey, Kirst, thanks so much for, you know, admitting people today and signing people in via the iPad," right? So I want you to have a follow-up plan where you're doing a touch or two. One, to acknowledge their commitment to you. So think of it like a donor acknowledgement. Instead of
Mhm.
giving their money, they gave their time. And
Yeah.
ultimately, without that human capital, a lot of these events and opportunities and community engagements, they don't often happen without a good amount of volunteer effort. So that's one thing. And we talk about volunteer recognition. I know a lot of our kind of event brains go right to being like, let's throw like a recognition something, right? It doesn't
Right.
need to be a big cost effect. It doesn't need to be a big to do, right? Volunteers are oftentimes so committed to your organization because they're showing up without pay. They're showing up to do the thing for you that
Mhm.
they just want to know you appreciate it. So it doesn't have to go from zero to like, a huge gala to say thank you so much. There's a big spectrum of how we can recognize the volunteers. The ultimate thing is saying, I acknowledge your commitment.
Mhm. I love that. And I think two things that I've just learned from you. We need to start using the words human capital. I love
Mm,
that. I think that just elevates what the value of the volunteer is. And not only the value of it, but how we and the nonprofit sector need to be addressing this and thinking about it, right? I mean, we can do a better job of valuing our volunteers as
yeah.
opposed to just be like, oh God, I got to make some work for these people to
Yeah.
do.
Well,
Because
and
I think,
we're talking primarily about the individual, like I'm talking volunteer coordinator to volunteer relationship, right? But
mhm,
think about how you can also communicate that impact to your community. So how many volunteers, how many unique volunteers did you have in your fiscal year? How many
mhm,
hours did that equate to? What is the hourly value of volunteer time in
mhm.
the market right now? Which I did look that up, so I can give you that stat too. But ultimately, like, this is stuff that you can share to your board, you can share in community reports. Do you even acknowledge volunteer names in your annual report, right? Do they get that extra special recognition?
Mhm. And tell me what your rate is, because I know you get this through the Bureau of Labor Statistics. It
Correct.
changes.
Yeah,
It's
yeah, and
also
in
different for
2024,
profession. Yeah.
So we look at it through the entire sector. In
Okay.
2024, it's
That's right.
$34.79. And
That's right.
this
Per
figure,
hour.
yep, per hour, this figure represents like the economic value assigned
Mhm.
by nonprofits, by researchers, by policymakers to like help
Mhm.
quantify that impact. So
Mhm.
if you show up for an hour of volunteer time at your organization, in your mind, count that as a $34.79 donation of time, right?
Yeah,
And that's a pretty big per hour dollar mark, right?
it is. It is.
Especially
And
if any of those roles are specialized.
yeah, and I think it's something that we need to be tracking. And I think it's also something that I would imagine the majority of our volunteers have never heard. I mean, they might have a sense of, oh, yeah, there's a value to what I do. But to actually quantify it and say, we track this and we report this back and it means something to us, it
Yeah,
has value, I think is a super cool thing because very few people will only volunteer on a project for 1 hour. If you think about it,
yeah.
the majority of what's going to go on is going to be to that 2 to 3.5, 4 hour level. So right
Mhm.
there, it's significant. So
Well, and
super cool.
as we're talking about ties to the community, when you are talking about volunteers, not every person that walks through your doors at an organization can cut you a five-figure check. Not everybody has that capacity or that comfort right now, right? But
Right.
this is a way where somebody can still really care about your mission and lend their time where they maybe don't have that financial resource to give you the impact. So having a way to talk about that quantity and ultimately show that volunteer like, holy cow, you are really actually helping us, like, lay
Mhm.
it on thick, because that's what it really means to your organization.
I love that you said that. I think that's really cool. And I had never really thought of it that way. I've always just thought of it as more an internal issue that,
Mhm.
we can report on this to our stakeholders and we can, use this as a further clarion call to how the community supports us. But I like that. I think that's a really, really smart thing. I knew you were a smart cookie before, but now. Okay, let's talk about demonstrating this impact. I mean, you talked about the labor rate. You talked about how we should be tracking this. My
Mhm.
first question is, do you find that nonprofits are tracking these numbers enough? Like, when they check somebody in and really acknowledging what's going on in terms of the actual hours and value?
Yeah, kind of sort of not really, right? That's the thing
Mhm.
that I as someone that's so involved in the data side of things, being uh kind of the liaison between what the product can do and how we should do it to the customer and how their workflow is, right? There's a lot of matching of that path to success. So
Mhm.
ultimately, when we think of how to talk about that impact and how to correlate it, it starts with the data, right? It starts with
Yeah.
collecting accurate data. It
Yeah.
starts with saying Julia signed in at 8:05 and she signed out at 12:35, right? How many hours is that? If we don't have a sign out time, we're just dismissing folks. Are we assuming they're all here for 2 hours, right? So start with the integrity process, and then also think about how you're tracking those commitments, because when we're talking about building really sustainable volunteer programs and being able to demonstrate the impact, think of this in the same manner as donor retention. So, first
Uh-huh.
time donors have statistically a much smaller percentage of coming back to you the next year. And that's
Right.
because sometimes we don't think of first time donors as being the most invested or the most involved, right? We kind of wait for that second or third gift to really steward them to their capacity. And that's ultimately, think about that kind of process and those statistics like volunteers. So
Mhm.
first time volunteers that come to one thing and they're like, okay, cool, that was fine. But if they don't get any kind of follow up nudges, or they don't get that acknowledgement of their impact, right, they're unlikely to come back. So we
Mhm.
want to make sure that we're kind of communicating their impact, we're making it sustainable, we're also reducing friction in that same time frame to allow that volunteer process to be easy for them.
Mhm. I love that. I think that's like again a more strategic approach. And one of the things I really hear you saying here is that we need to be thinking about this before we ever have anybody walk through the door. We've got to have a program set so we don't just like end the episode of their service
Mm-hmm.
and go, whew, that was great. No,
Yeah.
we should thank them, or we got to back the bus up and really have a plan, just like
Yeah.
we do for donors.
Well, and even if, because sometimes I'm more convinced by data, right, than I am
Mhm.
about just the gut feeling.
Right,
So
right.
ultimately, think of this as like, let's say we're thinking of that market rate for volunteers. You have one volunteer that volunteers or donates 10 hours of their time, right? We're
Mhm.
talking almost $350.
Yeah.
How many of the donors that you have in a given calendar year, how many of them are over that amount? Or how
Right.
many are under? Are they receiving more stewardship than that volunteer, right? Like that is something where we want to think about the opportunity. We want to communicate clearly. We want to make sure the donor, or not the donor, the volunteer themselves has a really great experience and that they have some follow up and they know how to get involved again. And that involvement process is very easy.
Mhm.
And ultimately, I think what most volunteers are just looking for is some sort of acknowledgement that they're having an impact.
Yeah, yeah. I'm going to ask you a question that I'm just so intrigued by what your answer's going to be. For years, there's a sense, and I think it still exists, that
Mhm.
you never, ever, ever ask a volunteer to engage in financial donation process.
Mm.
You don't even give them a needs list. You don't give them any collateral. You just keep that separate, and that
Yeah.
it's been considered bad form
Mhm.
to do that.
Yeah.
Um, and then there are others that are like, hell no, they've been here, they love us. Where do you fall? Help
Oh,
us understand.
yeah, yeah. So I fall in the let the volunteer make their own decision camp. And I
Okay.
fall in the let the donor make their own decision camp because I hear this from a fundraising perspective a lot. Well, those first time donors came to an event or they donated through peer to peer or they donated because of a tribute gift. I'm not going to ask them for this annual appeal. And I'm like, but we don't know their motivation behind it,
Right.
especially if we don't know that donor, right? So when we're talking about volunteers, I think we have a big opportunity to say, let that volunteer decide if they want to opt in or opt out to those kinds of asks, right? And statistically, like, should have brushed up on this stat for me, but like the majority of donors to an organization have volunteered in the past, right? So
Right.
that is actually a really, a really, really great, I want to call it like field to farm, right?
Yeah,
If you're
big way.
looking to grow your annual donor base, right, that dollar amount doesn't have to be massive. They may not have the capacity to write a 4 or 5 figure gift, but they will be very likely because if they're giving you your time, like their time to your organization, they're more than likely to support you financially. Let them make that decision. Don't close that door and lock them out of contributing even more to that opportunity.
Yeah. Where do you lie on like a needs list versus or an
Mhm.
actual giving, pitch, like join our monthly giving society, or where do you see those opportunities?
I think this can be personalized to the volunteer, right? So it kind of depends what that relationship is. Like for more of the one time donors or the one time volunteers, maybe they come once or twice a year for a special event. Maybe we ask them to contribute to the annual appeal, right?
Okay.
And then other organizations that I've worked at have had longer term volunteer commitments where they say for 6 months, you're going to do this because it's kind of specialized, or you have to have specific training in this. You're going to do this. Those organizations that make that much larger commitment to you, they may be a better ask to go to something like a monthly donor or a quarterly donation, right?
Mhm.
So I think this if I have a sentence that kind of will sum up my approach to fundraising, it's that as fundraisers, we want to recognize behaviors over capacity, right? We always, of course, want to keep their capacity kind of insights into our back pocket, but I want you to see people who are showing up over and over and over again. It's the
Yeah.
same approach I take to building recurring donation programs. If you've got a donor that's giving for 4 consecutive years, and they may not be giving you a ton of money, but they're giving you $50 every time. Maybe that's someone that's wanting that next step. How do I get involved a little bit more? We want to encourage them in that manner to say, join our monthly donor program. I can see that you're incredibly loyal because you're giving year over year. It's the same aspect with volunteers.
Mhm. I love that you said that. And I love that you are encouraging us to, not shut them out. You, as you said, don't close the door on this, but also allow them to make that decision. Because in my mind, Kirsten, that when somebody comes to your site, especially if you have a campus or,
Mhm.
you have something that's going on, it's one thing to learn about what it's like to work in a food pantry,
Mhm.
but when you go there and you're filling the boxes and you're handing them to families and you see what goes on, I
Mhm.
think there's just so much more of an opportunity to really connect with somebody and build that relationship.
Oh,
Um,
absolutely. Yeah, it's
but I
very
think we
hard to be
don't
in
do
a
it.
space like that and not have your heart be very connected. So,
Yes.
it's
Yes.
a really great opportunity. And the last thing I'll say about that as well is like oftentimes as fundraisers and nonprofit administrators, we write a lot of stories. We do a lot of content marketing, right? Where we say, Julia was a recipient of these services. Look at what Julia's been able to do, XYZ. Now I want you to think about, are we translating that content story to a volunteer so they can
Yeah.
understand their commitment, right? And they can
Right.
understand their impact. So
Right.
that is something, again, full circle. As you're collecting those other stories, make sure
I
it's kind of
agree.
hitting all your stakeholders, which
Yeah,
include
I
your
agree.
volunteers.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think I call it the volunteer witness, but the
Mhm.
volunteer story, a volunteer story needs to go into your annual report, undoubtedly. Like, what does
Absolutely.
it mean to me to volunteer? Why do I do it? What did I see? How did I feel?
Mhm.
The joy of volunteering, the joy of community service, is something we need to herald. We need to be showing that, and yet it's very interesting to me that we're all about storytelling, but we forget to add that. And to me, I think those are riveting stories.
Yeah, and again, very impactful, and people
Yeah,
that are the ones that are donating their time, they are going to be the ones that are pretty darn committed, right? So
yes,
oftentimes we may get a couple donations here and there from a volunteer, and maybe it's that donation so you stop sending them appeals, right? So when you have someone showing up constantly, dedicating their time, committing to making your organization more efficient, having a certain reach, being able to even give you just operational support, it is something you want to rely on and make sure that one, they're having a great experience, two, you have some way to follow up, but make sure that cultivation plan is incredibly strong, because those are going to be some of the most dedicated members of your community.
hmm. Well, this has been a fabulous conversation. It's summertime for so many of our nonprofits, 1.8 million of them across the country. They're ramping up for big volunteer actions. And
Mhm.
so, this is an amazing conversation that we really need to be more thoughtful about. Kirsten Wantland, a manager at and customer service best practices and enablement over with our friends at Bloomerang. Really exciting conversation. Thank you so much for investing in yourself with your education so that you could invest in our sector. I'm so appreciative, and you give me hope for the future, sister. I'm telling you, because it's really cool to see that we can be educating professionals in our sector. It's not just all about having a good heart.
I will also say that like the best part about my education and my experiences is a lot of cross collaborative opportunity, right? So something I loved about my master's in my education was that half of it was leadership theory. That helped me take a really wide kind of strategic approach to a lot of the problems we see in the nonprofit sector. And I feel the more that we share what we learn from those kinds of experiences, the more successful we can be
Yeah.
as a sector. So thank you
Yeah.
so much for having me.
Oh my gosh, it was really cool. Like I said, you've really, you've made me realize why we do this, why I personally do this work, right? And why we as a company do this work. It's really about navigating people forward with education so that we can do, better with the things that we want to do better with, right?
Awesome.
And because passion only takes you so far.
Yep.
And so we've
Absolutely.
got to have education. We have to have strategy. So thank you so much. We are very strategic with our presenting sponsors, and they are strategic with us. They support us and they help us further our mission. And those folks include Bloomerang, American Nonprofit Academy, Staffing Boutique, JMT Consulting, Interim Executives Academy, Your Part-Time Controller, and Fundraisers Friday. Wow. Okay, I'm going to go out there and do better and do more. So thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks, everybody.
It's been a lot of fun. Hey, we end each and every episode with this message, and it goes like this: to stay well so you can do well.